this is Eric from Cafe Watercolor. Happy Mother's Day. If you are a mother, I wish you have a wonderful weekend with your loved ones. So today I'm going to demo this portrait that I painted of my grandmother. She is turning 100-year-old this year, which is quite amazing. I don't see her that often. She lives in Taiwan and I am in the US. I don't go back to Taiwan that often. Hopefully I will get to go back and see her this year. Last time I see her is about 3 years ago. She was still healthy and happy. I painted another grandma portrait on my mother's side a couple years ago. And when I painted that portrait, she was unfortunately no longer with us. I gave the portrait to my mother. She was very happy. She got tears in her eyes. And I was very happy to be able to do that for her. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to show my grandma the portrait myself. So I am very happy that my grandma on my father's side, she will be able to see this portrait in person. I wouldn't say I am very close to my grandma because I moved to the US when I was 14, so I don't really get to spend much time with her during my teenage years and my adulthood. But I have fond memory with her when I was little. We get to visit their home during Chinese New Year's and other occasions. She was always very gentle, kind, and a happy lady. And one of my best memory is that when she visited us, when I was still in Taiwan, I was elementary school, I had problem with subtraction in math. I was second grade. She was able to taught me to figure out how it works. It's 2-digit subtraction, and to me it was like rocket science because I wasn't a very smart kid. I'm still not a very smart person. Math is always my pain point in school and in life as well. I remember I made a mistake when I was adding up tips in the restaurant when I was paying my bill. So as you can see, I am pretty horrible with math. I became an artist for a reason. Anyways, she taught me how to do math. So it was a very fond memory because she was very patient and she taught me very, very well. So back to the painting, I spent a lot of time doing the line drawing and then now I start my first wash. The first wash for portrait is always sort of relaxing but mentally challenging because you just lay down colors and there's almost no contrast in your portrait. And as opposed to oil and acrylic, you get to establish your contrast very quickly because you can just paint over the middle value and the light value. Watercolor, you need to work from light to dark. So when you just lay down your first wash and even your second wash, your value is still very, very light and you get to see minimum amount of contrast. And it's a little bit hard to judge if you got the structure of the face correctly without contrast, without lighting. So I usually need to spend a little bit more time doing the right drawing and even draw some construction lines when I was doing the line drawing underneath. So fortunately, I think the drawing for this portrait is relatively pretty accurate. Now, I'm not going to say it's 1-to-1. I didn't use a grid or anything, so I'm just trying to match it, trying to measure it to the best of my ability, but I think it's close enough. And the first wash is mostly establishing just the color, and I just lay down the second wash, so that brings a very basic contrast between light and the dark side of her face. But as you can see, there's no detail, no structure on any specific facial feature. And we left that out on purpose because if you go ahead and paint all those in before everything else, the whole portrait can fall apart very quickly. Unless you are very confident, you are very, very good at it. I usually try to do layer by layer, step by step. So this is the second layer after first wash is dry and I did a lot of wet onto wet there. And now I slowly start to develop her facial features, give it some structures. starting from the eye socket, and I connect that to the other part of her face. When I paint a portrait, I don't focus just on a specific facial feature. I don't just paint an eye and take it all the way to the end and then move on to the other eye and so on. I usually try to paint them and start to connect them to each other as a whole. And I start to develop and define the facial feature more together. So I didn't take one eye all the way to the end, but I connect that to the other eye and give it some basic structure for the nose, and now I connect that value to the lip, and so on. And this is a sped up version of the painting. I do have a unedited, unsped up version demo on my Patreon. I share painting demo there once or twice each month from the beginning to the end. This painting specifically took me about an hour and a half to an hour and 40 minutes. So it's not a very fast painting, but I still think it's relatively not so time consuming if you know what you're doing. So 2 layers in, you start to see the basic structure, the basic contrast between light and dark on her face. Now the dark area still feels a little bit flat because we don't have enough darkness, enough contrast in there. So now the 3rd layer, I start to really paint some dark in to really sculpt her face. Now she is old, there's no way around it, so I have to paint quite a bit of wrinkles and muscle structures and things like that. But when I'm painting wrinkle, I don't paint small lines. That's not how I do it. I try to paint small shapes, small little bits of structures to hint that her face have different details. And it's very important not to paint a lot of lines when you are painting a portrait, because line itself is a one-dimensional element. So if you add a lot of that kind of element into your painting, you're going to flatten out your painting, unless you do that on purpose, unless you try to introduce some graphical element into your painting. I usually try to avoid lines. I can paint small shapes like the shadow from her eyelid. Those are very small, but even when I paint those shapes, I still think about shapes and values instead of lines. So as you can see, I start from the eye socket and I connect my way down to her lips and the nose, and now I start to work on her other eye. So it's very important that you always try to find shapes to connect. Again, don't just paint an eye and leave it and paint something else. You want the face, you want the portrait to look cohesive. Everything belongs to her face, and you want everything to work together. Just that each layer, the shape gets a little bit smaller because I'm painting darker and darker. So now you can see that her face is much more defined. But if you squint your eyes, the basic contrast is still there. The light on the right side and the dark on the left side. Just that within that dark area, we see a lot more details and smaller contrast. So adding a bit of definitions on her ear. The ear is very complex, but I try to keep it simple so it doesn't compete with her face. We want the viewer to focus on her eyes and her nose, mostly her eyes. Painting her hair, and I add some transitional value between the hair and her forehead, and I try to soften the edge with some clean water, some damp brush. And look at how I work my brush from different directions to create different directions of brush strokes. Because I treat my paintbrush almost like a sculpting tool, and when you're sculpting something, you rarely do it from a single direction. You want to create a flow on the form, on the structure. So it's the same thing when you are painting. And to do a loose painting, I always said that it's not about speed, it's about how much thought you put into it before you paint a brushstroke. It's about how little you paint. If you paint a lot of tiny little brushstrokes and you are just dabbing around and you just get a lot of details in, chances are for watercolor it's going to get dirty. But if you try to think about your brushstroke every single time you paint, and you lay down in the right place, in the right value, and you can describe something complex with a few simple brushstrokes, that makes a good loose painting. And there's no exception for a portrait. Now, while my grandma's face does have a lot of details, there are details that I have to ignore, or there are details that I have to simplify. So now I'm working on her clothes. She's wearing an orange hoodie. It's very bright and orange. It looks great on her, but in a portrait, in this painting, if I make it too saturated, it's going to be distracting. So I dull it down quite a bit. And adding some dark wet onto wet just to hint some form, turning. And it's at this point I decided that I'm going to do some background, especially on the right side, because we don't feel the contrast of the light on her face. We want that light on her face to feel brighter. So here I am mixing a cool value and start to paint the background. And by doing that, you immediately see her face popping out from the background. The light feels lighter and her face just feels a lot more defined. And I also give it a little bit of background on the left side because I feel like the area on the left is a little bit empty and I want to give it just a little bit of connection between the portrait and the background. Some more details and we are finished. I hope you enjoyed this quick demo and my portrait. Again, if you are a mother, happy Mother's Day. You are very, very special and very important in this world. And I wish you have a wonderful weekend with your loved ones. This is Eric from Cafe Watercolor. I will see you next time.